All right. Hello and welcome everyone to the extension video, the lesson video on the Portal Gun episode of Waveform. This is going to be, the format of this is just going to be very chill, very laid back, just talking about what the session actually is, what each part is, how I went about designing the sound, the nitty gritty details of each layer and how they're made up, things that we just don't have time to really get into or that wouldn't be interesting to a typical waveform viewer. This is for more of the sound designer crowd out there, for who people who want to take the sample library from the Patreon and maybe try to recreate it in their own session. So I'm just going to walk through every part of the session. I've got some green tea here. We're just going to chill out and go through this together. Okay, so I just want to start off with a little explanation of what the session is, what you're looking at here. So I'm working Live 10. I usually do. I work in Live 10 and Reaper. That's one of the most common comments that I get on the YouTube channel is what DAW I use. I use Ableton Live 10 for a lot of creative sound design, and then Reaper for a lot of sort of batch processing stuff, basically everything other than creative sound design. And so then just looking at this session really quickly, I'll just break down what these large group tracks are. I've got this rifle example. This was the example that I just up on the top here. This is that example from the video where I talked about, what a fizzle layer would sound like on a typical gunshot. It's sort of the high end, with mechanics and without mechanics thing. So this is the sound that I made for that example. So we won't necessarily go over that. I mean, that's just kind of a gunshot sound. But this right here, starting on the second track, also apologize if you hear some generators and stuff going on outside. There's some guys working around the house. But we'll get through that. So the group tracks that follow the rifle example thing, V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, are the 5 versions that I made of the Portal Gun before I was happy enough to put it in the episode. So this is 4 failed attempts, and then the attempt that failed less and made it into the episode. So I'll start by the first thing that we'll listen to is go through these, but I'll just show you quickly what the rest of this. This is just the samples where I sourced them from. Just got the little recordings out for demonstration in the episode. Here's the original sound and the bounce version of my final one, and then this is the final sound that made the video, and then over here is just some scrap work for visualization stuff on the EQ. Like when I show in the episode like an EQ appear, I have to screen capture it. So I recorded in this, and so that's pretty self-explanatory. But over here is where the majority of the time this lesson will be spending is V1 through 5. So it seems like maybe more iterations than you're used to me talking about on an episode, because I typically in an episode will only focus on the final version, or we'll talk about how I made the final version. I don't often go into detail on how many tries it took me to get to that version, but in this case it took me 5. It sometimes takes a lot more than that and sometimes takes a lot less. It just depends on how difficult the challenge is and how creative I'm being that day, or if I'm kind of struggling. But this was a struggle. This took, each version of this is an entire separate weekend day of work, basically. V1 I might have done on a Saturday, and then I finish at midnight or something, and I just can't work on it anymore, so I duplicate it out. This is typically the way that I'll work, is if I know something's going to take a lot of days to get right, and I have the time to spend, what I'll do is I will just, at the end of my day, when I'm sort of feeling ear fatigued and I feel like it's time to finish for that day, I'll duplicate the track. So I'll just Command D in Ableton, make a new group, and then rename this whatever version it is, and then from the next day, I'll just drag this over here, and I'll start fresh again, so that I can always save the old versions back here for reference purposes, which is always a great thing to do. Even if you don't think you need to do it anyway, because it's, people aren't perfect. You're not going to remember. Like sometimes you're designing and you say to yourself, oh, this is great. I've gotten to a cool place. Let me just try to tweak this thing a little bit more in this right direction. And then 20 minutes later, you don't know how it happened, but all of a sudden you have a shitty sound. You're going, okay, like, what did I lose? How do I get it back? And you Command Z, and then it's helpless. You can't get back to it. You lost the magic, and then you get frustrated, and that's when, you end up deleting sessions and starting over. And I never like to try and do that. I want to save my past work. I want to work up from it and try and get better and better, without sort of like deleting hours and hours of attempts. So that's one way that I get around that. And that's something I learned from sort of electronic music production, was that duplication trick where You make a synth patch for a drop or for a verse in a song or a chorus, and then you go, I kind of want to make this better. So you duplicate it, you mute it, and then you start from, treat that as your new base level. And then if you can, make an improvement on that, then you keep it, and then you delete the old one. But if you don't make an improvement, at least you can fall back on the version you started with. So that's a technique that I use very often. Okay, so let's listen through these versions. Version 1 through the eventual version that made the episode, and we'll listen through and talk about each one. So here's version 1. Version 2. Version 3. Version 4. And version 5. So version 5 is what made the episode, but I think all of these examples have their strengths and weaknesses. Version 1, I think, version 1 and 2, I think, are the worst of the attempts, just because the low end isn't quite right. I felt a lot like the original version had a very distinct low end. It had a very hard to describe and very unique low end character to it. It kind of sounds, if we listen closely, just again like we did in the episode, it has the quality to it like a door closing or like a drawer slamming shut or something. Very wooden and very, very realistic and grounded. It's really not at all like a synthetic sine wave kind of a shot, like a lot of typical sci-fi weapons are these days, where you get the bass is just almost a sine wave. It's not like that. It's got a very full low end. You notice if you look at the EQ, one thing that I took note of when I was first starting was how it's very flat. The actual EQ of the sound itself, if you take a snapshot of it, is very full spectrum. It's not like you have a bump up here and then a bump up in the highs or anything and then no middle. It's very full spectrum, and I imagine that was just because it's kind of the most important sound, maybe besides the dialogue in Portal, because it's the sound you hear most often. So you can sort of afford to have that full spectrum quality. So the first attempt uses a lot of samples that didn't actually make the episode, or that I didn't end up using for the final version, and therefore were not in the script of the episode. You can see I've broken it into the same 3 categories that I did end up using in the final episode: the sizzle, the shot, and the tail. Here's version 1 again, just so we can hear it. So here's the sizzle, the top end, the shot, and the tail. The problem with this one, I thought, were the shot and the tail. The sizzle didn't really change much V1 through 5, because it's kind of a nondescript hiss sound, and that's somewhat easy to replicate, so it wasn't the biggest deal, and it stays pretty much the same. But this shot, it doesn't have the same low end characteristics that I wanted the replica to have. It doesn't have the same drawer closing feel. It has much more of a EDM kick drum feel to it, even though I'm not using any kick drums at this stage. Ironically, I add kick drums later. This is more of a so this uses some gunshot sounds, a 357 Magnum fire, just as the thwap kind of thing on the transient. This little single shot, sort of very, very narrow EQ band that's adding a little bit of the knock characteristic. I thought that adding around a 300 hertz knock or 350 hertz knock would allow it to sound more woody. But I kind of, whenever I get into this EQing stuff where I have, only a single small band of detail, it kind of can be shaky where you're adding small frequencies like that. You can, get into shaky territory with compression later, where you're not quite sure if it's all going to come together and sound like one cohesive sound or just a bunch of tiny little layers that shouldn't be together. So I try to avoid that, but in this case, I thought it was going to add character. I was totally wrong. The tail is similar to the final tail, except for the fact that I added a lot of extra elements. So in addition to the wind that I end up using in the episode, there's also a thunder and lightning layer and a glass layer that sound like this together. So they add that little extra bright shimmery character that the wind doesn't necessarily have on its own. But that might not necessarily be the most accurate thing. So it's not ideal maybe to have that. So I ended up scrapping those and going for a version 2 that was much more simple. So actually, no, version 2 is still complicated. Version 3 is where it simplifies. Version 2 sounds like this, and you can see this was sort of a spastic version that I threw together with the tail from the original. I didn't even bother to group this into shot and fizzle. It's all sort of just there. I wasn't happy with this one at all. I think I scrapped this and worked again from version 1 for number 3. So version 3 is where it starts to get more cohesive. And this is where I think the addition of the kick drums really comes in. Yeah, so we have a kick drum. We still have the shotgun sounds that didn't make the final sound. We also have this wood door open. And then we also have this explosion layer, and then this kick, which is the majority of the character of this version. The kick I thought was going to add, and I think it does add, almost like a basketball bounce quality. This kick doesn't have, and it really does sound like a basketball bounce, actually, now that I think about it, with like a heavy transient. But I didn't want the kick to have, like I said, that synthetic sine wave characteristic where, you know, if you compare this waveform to a typical 808, you can see the difference just in the actual, in the actual way that the wave looks. You can almost tell how synthetic it is based on just the wave. So like, look at the difference there. This is like, you can see the roughness of this wave as opposed to this one. I didn't want it to look like this one because this is very synthetic sine wavy sound, and it wouldn't have captured the same quality. Like the original doesn't have that texture to it. So, or the original does have the texture and the kick drum doesn't. The 808 kick wouldn't. So I opted for a more basketball bouncy kind of a kick drum. And I think here's when I realized that the kick drum was going to be better than the gunshots to sort of continue on making better versions of the sound. I still wasn't happy with the bass on this. As you can tell, it kind of has, it's a little too cartoony. It's a little bit, it has that sort of laser quality that's a little bit campy and not quite right for the portal gun. It just doesn't feel quite like it lives in the same universe. So the fizzle, I think I reworked from here on out, and then we went to a version 4, which still had the kick drum, but now instead incorporated a lot more in the fizzle layer. So the fizzle layer became a little bit more complicated, and I replaced a lot of the low-end stuff in the shot with other samples. So we, pitching down kick drums, repitching everything, trying to start over from scratch. And here's what we ended up with the fourth version. So the fizzle on this is much more pronounced. The shot is a little bit more bassy, but it's still not quite as resonant and long. It hits the right feeling, but it doesn't stick around as long as the original. The original has a tail to it that this doesn't have yet. So when I eventually finished with version 4 and duplicated it out to version 5, that was what I was trying to do, was bring version 4 into a more, bring the bass into a more comparable place than the previous versions. So the shot ends up sounding like this when we get to version 5, which I was really happy with at the time. I still don't think it's perfect. I really don't think I ever could get it perfect, but it's about as good as I was willing to get it. And then the fizzle starts to sound really nice and clean. It's super high end. It's very, very, very high end stuff. It doesn't even have, I think, below like, yeah, I mean, look at this EQ. Like, this is ridiculous. This is all high end. But that's actually what the original sounds like. So if you compare that to the original, and we listen to what that sounds like in comparison, take a look at this, EQ out some of the lows. That's what I was going for, was that little bit of sand on top, that little extra grit. So that's what I did with the fizzle, and this is where the tail simplifies. I remove the wine glass, the glass shattering, as well as the what was the other sample that we put in there in version 1? The thunder. So we remove thunder and lightning, and we just go with the hang glider wind. So the wind duplicated now, and there's a little bit more low end at the beginning, and then it tapers off to this like 1K, 2K hump over here. Here's what the tail sounds like. And this low part just gives a little bit more meat to the first couple rotations of the auto pan, or of the tremolo rather. It's an auto pan, but it's functioning as a tremolo. And so I think it added a little bit more of a smooth transition between the shot and the tail. So altogether, version 5 sounds like this again. We'll play it a couple more times just so you can get a sense of where we ended up. So the shot was what I tackled first, and I ran into a couple problems here that I at first didn't know quite how to solve. There's a lot going on in the original sound that needs replicating, and I like when you do these kinds of tasks as a sound designer, it's not as if you're making creative decisions sort of however you feel that they should be made. You're making them in order to fill a very specific role or frequency that the original sound has. So it's kind of like adds that little extra level of restriction with something like this. Like where if I were making this, just if I were assigned this weapon on a project and I didn't have to reference the original, we weren't trying to replicate it, I wouldn't probably go to the same lengths here to have a shot layer and a fizzle layer. I probably would just design it and hope to stumble on something interesting and then try to nurture that. But this breaking the shot out into all these individual layers and having specific frequencies come in and out, like having this 445 hertz little explosion dip in, halfway through. I mean, that's just something that I would never do in a sound design of a normal weapon. It's just the kind of thing that only serves the purpose of replicating something specific that occurs in another sound. So this is kind of atypical for me sound design wise, but I think all the layers do come together and form a somewhat cohesive shot layer. Here I'm employing this like little fade in that I've sort of grown to love a lot more lately. Basically, instead of having the fundamental thing, or at least the first thing that people try when they start sound design, when they're making weapons or when they're making explosions and stuff like that, is to have the transient start right at the beginning of the sound, have 0 milliseconds wait time before you actually spark up this transient and make the sound fire off. I think that definitely has value, and it's super, it's a standard way to do things. It's a fun kind of powerful way to make a sound, but it's also, when you have the luxury to make it a little bit delayed, it's sometimes fun to add a little bit of a fade in. So this fire whoosh sound and this wood door, this reverse sound, were a little fun way to lead in to the actual kick, which starts here, which is still that same basketball, that bouncy kick that I was using before. So it's a nice little fade in, and because it gets out of the way in time, like for example, if I were fading in, I wouldn't want to do this, because if I faded in and then let the sound build up into the point of this transient, it removes the power from this transient. It removes the surprise of it. But if I remove this back like it is in the final sound, and I give it some space to breathe, so take a listen to the difference. Giving that little extra space of silence before the transient almost like gives your ear a little bit of time to refresh so that it actually hears the transient and it's more clear. So if I solo these two layers, you'll see what I mean. And then if I drag this out, it's very subtle, but it's those kinds of things that when you're listening to something in the mix of the actual game, you can hear the difference. And actually, I'll exaggerate this a little bit by moving this away. And then versus this. So you see how it removes that little extra bit of character to have it right up against the edge of the transient? I think that's just one of the little tricks that when you have something in the mix of a game, like it might sound fine in the DAW when you're just playing it back, but then when you put it in the mix and you see how it functions in game, you often need that little extra bit of clarity, that little extra definition, and you'll go back and say, how do I bring this transient out? And that's what actually this is right here. You'll see this little edit on this clip. This is something I'll do in lieu of transient shaping. Transient shaping, I'm not often a fan of transient shaping with a plugin. Don't ask me why. I don't know. It just seems to me like I have less control. It's if you put a plugin on the transient of this kick, it's you don't really see how it's actually behaving on an audio level. You kind of just have to mess around with the parameters until you feel it's functioning right, and then hope that makes sense for the rest of the mix. I don't like to do that. So oftentimes the first thing I'll do when I'm shaping a transient is I will just Command E on a Mac. I'll just move out this little bit of the sound. So I'll show you what it looks like. I'll move out this little section, this transient at the beginning. I'll just fade it into the original clip, and then I can actually shape the transient however I want. So I can go, maybe I'll bring it down a little bit, maybe I'll exaggerate it, and I'll have it push into a saturator and then a limiter so it hits a little harder. So with this sound, that was something I did, is I separated out the transient and the body of the sound. It ended up being that I think I kept it. Yeah, both of these are at minus 0.63 decibels, so I didn't end up keeping the difference in volume. But originally it probably would have looked something like this, just because I wanted the definition of the snap of the transient a little bit more. So it's something I do all the time. So after that, we have this flashlight power zap on layer that I mentioned in the episode. This is really after the shot. It's more of a it's kind of like the equivalent of adding a bullet whiz by to a sniper gunshot sound, or to a silenced pistol sound, where you add the of the bullet in addition to the actual shot of the gun. This is like that, but synthetic. It's a little bit like the fizzle layer, but it just is a little bit more low end, and I've automated an EQ here to have it sort of close over time. The EQ automation on this is just like a typical filter on like a synthesizer. It takes the top end of the sound, and so if you see the playhead here, if I just try and move this along, so you can see it closes over the period of the zap sound. So it kind of like removes the high end. It keeps it around for less time, so that it feels like the sound has a little bit more movement. That's another trick that I do on a lot of layers that maybe are too bright, or that stick around too often, or that don't necessarily mesh with the rest of your sound. You can put them through a filter, put them through some effects, see if they still work. If they do, then great. If they don't, then just get rid of them. So this happened to work a little bit better with the zap kind of like filter sweep effect on it. It's the same kind of effect that you'd see on any typical synthesizer, where you have a filter cutoff, where you have a timed filter that meow 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 meow. It does that to the same EQ on the actual patch itself. It's doing the same thing, but to this sound. So Fire Whoosh, this is pretty self-explanatory. It's the white noise, if you will. It's the glue that ties together this whole sound a little bit more. One technique that I used to see a lot in electronic music production, that I kind of view this as the equivalent technique in sound design, is that people would often put a layer of white noise underneath their entire track and sidechain it to the kick drum of their song. So it kind of adds a little bit of, it removes some of the headroom of the song, but it also adds a little bit of a subtle pulsing effect to the entire tune. And of course, the white noise is never really audible to hear, or for you to go, oh, there's white noise in this, but it just adds that little bit of extra glue or noise bed to the track that suggests that all the sounds are coming from the same place. And I kind of view this Fire Whoosh as a similar thing, where with it's going to add a little bit of context to the rest of the layer. So if I solo this layer without it, and then solo it with it, or play the layer back with it, it kind of, I think it's a very pronounced effect. It really does a lot to put all these sounds into the same sort of room, if you will. I think it's a great effect, and I use it all the time. Just a little bit of white noise, like having a sample library of white noise. I think I've mentioned this in an episode of Waveform before, but having a sample library of white noise that you can just go to for these kinds of effects. Here I used a Fire Whoosh for the sake of the narrative of the episode, but you could very easily use white noise, and it just adds that little bit of extra brightness that I think a lot of sounds need. So then we have this explosion layer, and this again is that knock, that little. And this is just strictly basically to add character. This is, me hearing something in the original version. If you listen to I'm sure we can hear the inspiration for that layer. If we go to the original sound, so that knock happens at about 235 hertz. If we listen to the original, yeah, so that's my attempt at remaking this part of the sound. So here's what it sounds like in my version again. I'll go over to that layer. So it doesn't have the same low end because we're not hearing it in the context with the extra kick drum and everything. But that's my attempt at suggesting that little bit of extra character in the shot layer. And then we have, last but not least, this little extra kick, which is actually, oh no, it's not the same kick. Yeah, these are all different kicks. This is my attempt at doing the bass part that's in the original. It's sort of this and a bunch of other stuff that combine together that I'm trying to use to recreate that drawer close sound. And so if we listen to all the kicks together, it's kind of like halfway between an electronic music kick drum and then a basketball kind of bounce. And then I just needed this layer because without it and with it, I needed that little extra bit of time for the low end to resonate in the shot. Otherwise, it doesn't stick around long enough, and it just doesn't sound powerful enough. It doesn't sound even remotely close to the original. I'll show you the entire layer with that kick drum and without, and then with. So that was, I think, one of the instrumental things. It's actually, I think it's pitched down. Oh no, it's pitched up quite a bit. So the kick drum normally sounds like this. So I pitched it up and removed the transient, gave it a little fade in. And then it adds that really great extra little bit of resonance. I think that's a super important part of the sound. So you'll notice that on the two of the kick drums, I have totally removed the transient. I've faded them out. I think it's kind of a mistake that almost everyone makes when they're starting sound design to keep the transients on like every sound that they add to their project. It's kind of just like a force of habit because on their own they sound so good, but then in practice, like you can really only have like one or two sharp transients in a sound like this before it just starts to become, the transient has no character anymore. It's just an explosion of full spectrum noise. Sorry, I hit the mic there. So I don't like that sound. I typically try to, if I do have multiple transients, I stagger them. So if I do have two layers that I really do both, I want the transient from both of them like really bad, I will stagger them like this because I can't stand hearing them on top of each other unless they're so different that they really do come together perfectly, in which case it's sometimes okay. But generally speaking, I remove transients of sounds that I know I don't need the hit from. So I'm getting my hit from here. I'm going to shape this however I want it. I don't need to have this sound or this sound fight with that at all. So I've rolled that off and I've let these become totally just bass. That's something that works on Explosions. I feel a lot too. So yeah, that's the shot layer. I'll go into a little bit more depth on the fizzle layer, which is maybe the simplest layer. Sounds like this. I'll turn it up for the sake of hearing it. It's very lasery. It's super high end. Like I said, it doesn't have any low qualities. It's just basically above, 5K, even maybe more than that. And it's made up of these three layers. This little almost like a bird chirp kind of whistle thing, very high pitched, sci-fi. Let's see what this sample is. Sci-fi, yeah, power zap down large. And then this slinky zap thing. And these all just come together to add, similarly to that white noise, to the flame whoosh layer that I was just talking about. They lend, a cohesiveness to the whole shot because the rest of these samples are cut up and very staggered and very choppy. This has to be there to smooth things out and sort of show you that this whole sound can be a fluid experience or like a fluid thing from start to finish. So I'll solo this. And then with the fizzle layer, it sounds like that. Okay, cool. Okay, so now we have the tail. The tail is the part of the video where I talk about that using math to find the original rate of the tremolo, and I think that's a really cool way to do it if you want to get that accurate with it. But you could just as very easily you could do this by ear and just say, okay, I'm going to turn this up until I feel it represents the original. So I just did it that way just because we were making a video. But typically I use AutoPan. I don't think I ever use AutoPan as an AutoPan. I use it as a tremolo. You can do that by turning phase to 360 or 0, where typically you'd see this change. It would pan the sound left and right, almost like the sound was rotating around your head. That's the purpose of this plugin. But I always use it like a tremolo. I just turn phase to 0, and this is, volume for the left and right channel are both going up and down at the same rate. And it makes it super useful as a very quick tremolo tool. And I use a lot of tremolo, so I love it. Like I mentioned a little bit before, there's a low end wind here, so it's not just the wind track. It's also this little low bit of wind, and I wanted this to act as like the smoother transition kind of thing between the shot sound and the tail. So without it, the tail feels like it comes on a little bit too suddenly, I feel. So listen to the shot with the tail, and then without this layer, and then with the layer. You can kind of hear there's that little extra bit of low mid character that aids the transition to the tail. I think it makes the tail sound more plausible, or more like it's a real part of the weapon, because you don't very often hear tails like this in weapons. So it's kind of a little bit shocking when you hear it. It's like, okay, what part of the gun is making that sound? Like, how could that realistically be happening? And of course, realism is not the goal of that sound, but it's kind of an interesting thing to think about when you're approaching sound design. So I added this little bit of extra low end, and if you listen to the original, you can actually hear a similar thing, and you can see it even in the waveform. So this would be the first cycle of the tail, and then subsequently they get smaller and smaller and thinned out. And so this one is what I was trying to replicate, like these two being a little bit bigger and having a little bit more low end. You can hear that little, that's what I was trying to emulate with the little low end bit. So yeah, that's all the layers. I'll just solo the tail and show you guys the V5 tail. So that's all the layers of the version that made the episode. So, but that's not where the design ended. This is version 5. This is the final layering of the samples that I talk about in the video. But then there's a little extra bit of design that happens down here and down here that I didn't include in the episode that I wanted to show you now. And it's something that I do very often. It's something that I think a lot of people do very often. So when I'm happy with a layer, I'll make a new track, and I'll make it bright red because that's what I always do. Call it resample. And basically, I'm going to sample this sound, and now I'm going to look at it just as an entire waveform. So just see what the wave looks like, compare it to the original, and then edit the wave as a whole sound and treat it just like its own sample. Treat it like it's the new start point. So what I do, and I don't know if this will work because I'm recording in OBS and I'm recording my mic and everything right now. Hopefully this will work. But I'll resample this. Yep, it worked. Okay, so now I'll turn this off. And now this sound becomes this sound down here. And this version 5 bounce, I'll then duplicate and layer back with itself. So I'll take two versions of V5 bounce, pitch one of them down, add a little bit more low end, and add some saturation to the low end, and then relayer it with itself. And it's kind of an interesting way to beef up a sound that you already made. Is if you're happy with it and you like the texture, then just double it, pitch one down a little bit, add some more effects to it, and then beef it back up with itself. It's kind of a cool technique that I do a lot. And I was looking at this, so when I compared the bounced wave, the reason I did this was because looking at the wave files, okay, I was thinking, so they're generally speaking the same shape. So I have, this sort of subtle lead in to the main transient, which occurs right here, and here it's right there. So I was happy with that. The lead in I was happy with. And then it has this part right here, which to me on mine looked a little bit less jagged. This had a little bit more character. So I wanted to add a little bit more of that character with the same wave file by just duplicating it out and then EQing. It kind of looked to me like this was low end because the peaks on this are a little bit taller, and that's generally like a sign of low material. So I just duplicated the track, pitched it down a few notches, I think. Yeah, a few notches. I pitched it down an octave, and then EQ'd out the highs, added some saturation in an attempt to emulate this section of the sound that I wasn't seeing in my wave. So I wasn't sure if I, had it accurate. So I just tried to add that little bit of extra texture. So here's what that layer sounds like on its own. And here's what our bounce sounds like again. And here's what they sound like together. So it's kind of like the same thing as the kick where I rolled off the transient and then added it, right after the initial kick drum or the initial basketball bounce is kind of like that, but it just needed a little bit more. Plus, like after a while on version 5, I kind of was experiencing ear fatigue. I wasn't super, I didn't even know if my version was good enough yet. So I between version 5 and this editing I did down here, I gave it a couple days just in between to let my ear kind of refresh and not think about the sound. And it's sometimes good even, if you work on this kind of stuff on the weekend, you go to work, go for a week, and then you come back and then look at the sound a week later and you go, okay, like this is actually much worse than I thought, which is typically what happens when you listen to it after not listening to it for a while. And then you go, okay, so here's where it's lacking. And in this case, I thought the lows were kind of lacking. So I added that, and then I bounced it again, and I created this little track called Final. And this track has the version I bounced from here, and it has this little extra bit of sci-fi layer. It's the same sound that I used to make the original layer, but I think it just needed at this point a little bit more bright sci-fi texture to it. And this is what happened here that made me think that this needed this, was I went to start editing the actual episode, and I made the clip where the actual portal gun sound, our version of it is in the clip of the original game. So it was in the mix of the original game. I was like putting our sound against the noise bed of the original game with all the ambience and with all the footsteps and stuff. And I was going, it just kind of sounds weak. It kind of like, I don't have the same definition that I felt with the original. It doesn't have the same presence. So I went back and added this rather than try to recreate everything again and go back to V5 and up the saturation of this, of the highs or whatever, or do, add a little exciter or whatever I could have done. Instead, I just treated it like a new sample and just said, okay, what would I add to this? And I added this little sci-fi thwap layer. So at that point, the sound was done. And so I bounced it out and I put it in the context of the episode, and I was happy with it. This is sort of a pretty typical look at the way that I approach sound design for an episode. There's a lot of atypical stuff in here just because I was trying to recreate something. And we've of course done recreations before, like the seismic charge video, and the beam rifle was not really a recreation, but a similar concept. But with stuff like this, it's pretty important to let yourself be open to making really crappy versions of what you're trying to do, because it's going to happen whether you like it or not. So it's nice to prepare for it with a little technique of, okay, I'm going to do version 1, then I'll duplicate it out at the end of the day. Then I'll give myself, a Saturday morning, I'll just come back and try to redesign it, see what happens. If I'm not happy with it, at least I can go back to version 1. And if I am happy with it, if it's a little bit better, then next weekend I'll make version 3 and version 4 and et cetera. So that's the approach that I took with this. I think we got pretty close to the original sound. Of course, we would never get perfect, but this is the best attempt that I could make at it. And I think this resampling technique is something that's super valuable as well. This is something that's not atypical for any of my designs, recreation or not. This is something I do all the time. It's a nice way to take a look at the actual wave you've created, and say, okay, so I've got a distinct lead in, I've got the transient that I want, then I've got this fade out that I want, and the tail is looking good. It's just a nice way to view your work. So that's the gist of the session. If you guys have any comments, I'll be happy to answer them below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hopefully this lesson, I know I only hit 40 minutes, but hopefully we'll keep doing these in the future, and let me know what episodes you guys want to see these for, or because I'm just sort of rambling on my own talking about these sessions. So let me know if there's topics you'd like me to cover in future ones, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.